We have all three here, and it is time for the Ask Us Anything, where you guys, it's open season on Razvan and Atila and Walter. Max has a question for Atila. Atila, you mentioned that a leaderboard way back when we first discussed it in a meeting would have made you work more on D-Libs. Would that be for social clout or the prizes? I'm guessing the former.
Social clout, obviously. I don't even like gifts anyway. I hate when people buy me presents.
Steve has some questions. Intpromote is going to cause large problems, mostly for no gain. Is there a possibility to make it less problematic? For example, you short spews a deprecation that is unnecessary.
Well, intpromote was put in because it was producing different results than C would for the same expression. And the point is to make it produce the same results for the same expression if it was in C.
Robert asks, what is the deal, long-term goal with live, GC, and memory in general with D? And only half jokingly, when can we admit that the GC is the best approach?
No. It is the best approach, but you know, we do have to cater to the use cases that can't afford it, which are not many, I don't think, in my opinion, but they do exist.
So what's the long-term goal?
The long-term goal is memory safety. You know, using the compilers as our friend to make sure that we don't write bugs.
Alex says, Walter, do you have the answer to my question way back? Okay, and the question that he's referring to was the one about the dips. Are there any dips that you would like a champion for at the moment?
At the moment, no. I have some dips in mind I want to write, but there's no progress on them at the moment.
Adam asks, when will preview intpromote be default?
Well, I'd like to do it now. It's been in there for a long time now. It really needs to be the default, and the old way should be deprecated. So I'd be happy to do it now.
I missed a question from Esna. What are the actions that are ongoing to increase the adoption of the D language in companies? Any marketing or sales speech? What, in your opinion, is the real blocking points of that adoption?
Well, I think ImportC is one of the blocking points, or the lack of ImportC. But Mike, you're doing a number of initiatives to create videos and set up a channel for D and all that stuff. And I think those are going to be really helpful.
I hope they are. I really think that in this day and age, that's the way to go instead of blogs. Ryan Callahan asks, where does the definition of size T live in the DMD compiler? It seems to get defined to unsigned int on 32-bit architectures, but on OpenBSD, size T is always defined as unsigned long, and it causes linker errors.
I'm not aware of it causing errors on that. We did have a problem with OS X with it causing errors because of name mangling problems with it being long.
So where's it defined in the compiler?
It's not actually defined in the compiler. It's defined in object.d.
Brian says the size T issue might be an OpenBSD specific issue because we're the only ones who unconditionally define size T as unsigned long. Brian has an update about the size T issue on OpenBSD. He says it wasn't with D. The issue was with LDC's compatibility on type sizes, which didn't understand OpenBSD. Elijah, repeating a question he asked Max earlier, if GC is the best approach, then can we have guards or barriers and concurrency and bump nursery?
We're not going to do memory barriers for the simple reason that even if you use the GC a lot in D, it's used nowhere near as much as it is in Java. And having those memory barriers slows everything down. And it's only worthwhile if GC is your primary allocation mechanism. Well, it turns out that actually the primary allocation mechanism for D is a stack local variable, which is 0 cost. And for all your local variables, having memory barriers on writes to them is just going to be terrible. I just don't think it's suitable for D. It's suitable for Java and other very, GC does everything in those languages, but it's not suitable for D. It'll be a net loss.
And concurrency?
Oh, a concurrent collector? Wasn't Reiner working on that for a while? I think they ran into some fundamental problems with it, and I haven't heard much about it since, so I don't know.
I see that there is a pull request which says a fork-based garbage collector, which is merged in D runtime.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's Linux only. That was the Silq project that Francesco Mecca, I think, did a while back, and Reiner got it over the finish line to get it up to date and merged. That was in one of the recent releases. Elijah clarified the question about the concurrent GC. He says, parallel GC is multiple threads marking. Concurrent GC means running the GC at the same time as the app. So will we get concurrent GC. I guess the forking GC we have now, Elijah, by the way, says it's a cool strategy, though I haven't looked at it yet. But yeah, the forking GC is not a concurrent GC, right?
Well, if we do it, I'm not going to be the one that works on it. I just don't have the interest level in a concurrent GC to do that. I'm more interested in getting the memory safety stuff and the @live stuff all working properly.
So that sounds like a nice project for somebody who is interested and knowledgeable.
Yeah, in the past, Reiner was very interested in the GC, and he did a lot of great work on it. So that's what we need is need a champion to think about how to make that work and to get it to work.
So Alex asked about the dip earlier, and you mentioned a potential bitfield dip. So he says, you want a champion for that one?
Yeah, that'd be a fairly straightforward one. And I don't even think it's controversial. So I'm not even sure we need a dip for it. Let me put it that way. What's a dip going to say? It's going to work just like it does in the C compiler. And we've already implemented it for ImportC. So it's, flipping a switch. Officially, we're supposed to have a dip for it, but pragmatically, it doesn't seem like it's worth it to write a dip for it.
Peter asks, are the companies listed on the D homepage still using D?
As far as I know, they are.
Generally, as far as I know, the way that the companies were added to the page is that, they contacted us and let us know that they were using them and requested to be put on the page. And we found out that some companies were using D and somebody went out and said, can we put you on the page? But we don't have a channel established with all these companies to find out if they're still using D. So it might be a good idea to start contacting some of these companies and say, hey, you guys still using D? And then,
I think that's a good idea because, if they stop using D, would they tell us? I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah. So we'll have to be proactive about doing that and making sure our list is accurate. I'm looking at Steve next. In the interest of including standard experimental logger in Phobos, the default log level is output everything. In order to use it in a library, it needs to be a higher default level. Can we commit to fixing that before including it?
Probably. I guess we need to hear some more opinions from the community first.
And Steve's final question. Can we get dual context support back as a compiler feature? Having to switch to LDC2 recently on ARM now reveals that I was unknowingly depending on this feature.
I'm not sure what you mean by dual context.
The lambdas, no?
If you need two context pointers, for example.
Oh, the two context pointers thing. I don't really understand what the problem with it is.
In some situations, you may need a context. For example, a nested function or a lambda may require a context pointer to a function where it was defined. And also, it turns out there are some situations where you need two context pointers. And Suleiman Sami implemented this. It got in, but then it was reverted.
I thought it was still in, the two context pointers.
It's a deprecated feature now.
Okay. I guess I don't know why it was reverted or what was the problem with it.
The reason was that it broke the other backend. So basically, Ian was the one who reverted this because GDC couldn't handle that.
All right. Well, that's a good reason. I don't think anybody's going to rewrite the GCC backend to support dual context pointers. And if we enable it for, just Windows or for DMD, then people are going to write this code that relies on dual context pointers, and then they're going to try to compile it with GDC or LDC, and it's going to fail, and they're going to be angry. It may just be more trouble than it's worth.
Eddie asks, he's comments and then asks, I think we should start using dub to build the core components, DMD, D runtime, and Phobos, similar to how Rust uses cargo. What do you think?
What would we gain, though? I mean, other than being able to use DMD as a library, I guess, that kind of thing. But other than that.
Well, he says there's more here I didn't see. This comes from the fact that we are promoting dub as the de facto build and package manager, but we don't use it in the core components.
Yeah, that's a good point. Still don't think it will make much of a difference, though.
Elijah suggests it could encourage people to improve dub.
That's also a good point because it definitely needs improving.
Walter?
Well, the more complex we make the build process, the more of a problem it could be. And I'd kind of like the compiler or the core stuff to be really easy to build because you need that to bootstrap everything else. So while I agree with the dog fooding idea and I agree with the idea that it looks good, it may be too problematic. In fact, I'd even like a build script that was an actual script file, not even a make file, just a script file with a list of commands to build it. And the reason for that is not a whole lot can go go wrong with it. For bootstrapping purposes, we need as simple a build system as we can do.
What are the long-term goals for Phobos other than no auto-decoding JSON XML replacements?
Memory allocation strategy should be up to the user of the library and not at a low-level decision by the library functions themselves. And there are many strategies for accomplishing that. One of them is implemented in std.path, where it creates paths and combines paths without ever allocating memory, because it uses the chain template to make it work. And so it defers all the memory allocation up to the user of the algorithms in there, which I think is a really neat way to make Phobos work with any allocation strategy the user wants to apply to it, rather than it being baked into an implementation. Another thing I'd like to see is to go through all the functions that throw and decide if they really need to throw, if there's a way the interface to the algorithm or function can be redesigned so throwing is not necessary. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see in Phobos much less interdependence of modules, i.e. modules being more independent of each other. So if I include std.x, all I get is x. I don't pull in the entire Phobos library. Another goal I'd like to see is the Phobos being header only, which has been a big success in the C++ community, where all you have to do is import from the library. You do not have to link in with the library binary. And the advantages to this are, one, it makes your build system a lot simpler, and the other is a perennial problem with having the switches that the library binary is built with being compatible with the switches you're building your other code with. And if you make it header only, this problem just disappears. So those are things I'd like to see as a future direction for Phobos.
I think we need to take it easy as well and take smaller steps. So I think that if we remove auto decoding, that's enough of a reason to have a V2.
Yes, I agree. V2 should just be auto decoding removal. We should stop talking about it and just do it. Andre figured out a way we can do the versioning, and we should just do it, be done with it, and then see how it goes. And if our versioning scheme is actually going to work with something like this, it's a fantastic test case for it.
Okay, Robert asks, when can we have nicer version numbers? D2.098 or even better, D2.0100 just looks unprofessional.
Well, having version numbers like, 1_n_z to me is always awkward and clumsy and ugly looking. So I don't know. I'm probably out of step with my opinions on that.
Well, we did discuss this in the past. I remember writing up a proposal that Martin Novak put forward, and we never really went anywhere with it. I think it's still sitting in a gist somewhere. So it's something I guess we could talk about in a future meeting. I could put it on the agenda and we could say, hey, is this something we want to do or not?
I agree. I know it's come up repeatedly, but one of the problems with the classic versioning scheme is it doesn't really fit with how we develop things with D. We don't do major versions and minor versions. We do incremental versions. And that doesn't really fit in the classic semantic versioning scheme. I think that's why it really hasn't gone anywhere with D.
First name, last name has a question for Walter. Any book on D in the making?
Well, I should ask you that, Mike. You write all my stuff.
I'm not aware of any books, any new books in the making. There's none from me. I know that much.
I think Ali has talked about doing an update to his tome on D. Very useful book he wrote, but he's thinking about updating it. So I don't know how that's going, if he's in the chat and can answer that.
Brian asks, Walter, what was your favorite class at Caltech?
Probably jet engines. I took a class in jet engines, and they worked through how to create a formula for the entire jet engine. And the cool thing about that was you could see which parameters you had to move to adjust the performance to get what you want. I never thought that could be done. And you could really see how the thing worked just by looking at how the formula worked on it. And it finally answered the question, why does a jet engine shoot the thrust out of the back instead of out the front? Because every description of how a jet engine worked did a lot of, that. And, you light the fuel and it blows out the back. And I always think, why doesn't it blow out the front? I mean, it's just a tube. So why isn't it blowing out the front? And it was the formula that finally answered that question for me. That was a really fun thing to find out.
Lance Bachmeyer asks, are there any plans to compile to JavaScript?
Oh, what a horrible idea. The thought has never occurred to me. So, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, although it's a horrible idea.
Can't LBC do it? Because if so, then we already have it, right?
Well, we already have a WebASM backend, so I guess why would we need a JavaScript backend?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Robert suggests that D to JS is a really good idea because the WebAssembly output is huge and JavaScript is, for most stuff, quick enough.
JavaScript has only one numeric type, double precision. How that fits really with D's notion of multiple integer types and different floating point types is kind of problematic. D has 64-bit longs. You cannot map that onto a 64-bit double because you're going to lose the bottom several bits of it because those bits are used to store the exponent. I don't really see how you can successfully have JavaScript as a backend unless you're going to go as far as emulating 64-bit math, which is going to be terribly, terribly slow. I don't think the JavaScript backend is suitable for being a target with D.
Robert, following up on his other question earlier about Phobos, the things you talked about are only changes but not additions. What about JSON schema support, event library, etc.? I believe you talked about some of that yesterday, Atila?
Put it up on code.dlang.org first, I'd say, just like I mentioned in the talk.
Put it up on Dub and kick the tires, but then we'll need a process for getting it. We'll need to formalize we'll need some kind of process to get it into Phobos.
Well, some type didn't really need a process and it made it in, so.
What is the most far-fetched avionics metaphor you ever did, Walter?
Well, I know Andre hates all my avionics or aviation metaphors. I think he hates anything with the word Boeing in it. So what's funny is he wanted me to, the origins of the D programming language. I put some roots of D and gearbox design in there, and Andre said, nobody's interested in that. Take it all out. And then when we sent it to review to the committee, they says, oh, these connections to Boeing are really interesting. Can you expand on that? So
yeah, they highlighted that.
Laugh on that one.
Yeah. Sebastian Kappa asks, what about borrow ownership directly on structs, like live on types? I'm interested in knowing that a struct has only one reference.
Well, that's what the @live attribute to D functions does. It does treat structs, and you can have only one pointer to your struct instance. It won't allow you to have any others.
What does having bitfields built into the language offer over the existing standard.bitmanip bitfields and standard.bitmanip bit array?
Bit array is something different from bitfields, but what it offers over STD implementation of bitfields is binary compatibility with the target C compiler, and the current scheme does not offer that. The second thing is it will implement bitfields directly rather than going through inline functions to accomplish it. It seems more convenient to do it directly because compilers, like the DMD backend has direct specific support for bitfields, whereas when you use D's version of bitfields, use functions and shifting and masking. So it's just more efficient.
Esna has a question for you, Walter. Any follow-up on your infamous, my word, memory safety will kill C statement in the previous AMA with Scott Myers?
Well, I still think it's happening. There's a lot of proposals to add memory safety and tracking ownership stuff to C++. When I was working on ImportC, I kind of got reacquainted with C and realized there's a number of really terrible things in C that are unsafe, that are still officially part of the C standard, and those things should just die. The C community shows no interest in fixing these problems, so I think programming is just going to pass C by. However, C itself is going to survive in terms of being an application binary interface because C is the lingua franca of the programming world, and that's how different programming languages are going to talk to each other. They're going to talk to each other through the C ABI, even though there may not actually be any C code involved in that. I think the C interfaces are going to persist with the operating systems, of course, but the actual applications I don't think will be written in C anymore. It's just too darn expensive to deal with those memory safety problems. The expense of those problems just kills the advantages C has. It's just too expensive. You can't afford losing millions of dollars having security breaches or ransomware attacks and all those other vulnerabilities. C is just a wide wide open for difficult to catch corruption and backdoors and all that stuff. So I think it's just going to be forced out. If I was a manager of a company building infrastructure, I would not use C for it for that reason.
Aikatsu asks, what is the state of @Live? I was pretty excited when it was released, but since then it hasn't received much love.
That's because I've been working on ImportC. I have not forgotten @Live. The first step is fixing DIP 1000. There have been a number of issues with it that need to be fixed, and then I can go back to work on @Live. And the reason for doing it in that order is DIP 1000 is foundational for @Live. DIP 1000 bug in particular is the one that Atila ran into, is when you have a return scope ref, it isn't clear, does the return attach to the ref or does the return attach to the scope? And I know how to fix that. I've laid all the groundwork for it. I just need to write the PR for it. It shouldn't be that hard. The other thing that's holding it up is I have more bugs than I'd anticipated for ImportC, and I need to get ImportC to a place where it's usable. I'm very, very close. I just need to, get over that last hill, and it should be usable.
I haven't forgotten @Live either, and I need to talk to Walter about it as well. I'm just being pushing back on it because he's working on ImportC anyway. But
Neto asks, I think we need to implement dips faster. There are features that only D has, but languages like C# are getting those. What are your thoughts on that?
For the last 15 years, other languages have been copying D features, but they're never going to be D. So I'm not terribly worried about it. I think like ImportC, we're ahead of the curve on that. I don't know of any other language other than C++ which does that. It makes it so easy to interface with C. So I think that's going to be a big advantage for us. I think the @Live thing is a feature that will set us ahead of the other native languages. I think we're actually in a good position. The major problem we have is the manpower to work on implementing all this stuff. That's really what's holding us back.
From Dennis Corporal for Walter, Timon Gare described @Live as a linting tool for @system code. @safe has to be waterproof without @Live, and with @Live you can still mix allocators. Any plans to improve the design yet?
Timon and I have fundamental disagreement about how an ownership borrowing system could be implemented. We're kind of at right angles to each other on how that should be done. I don't think it's possible to make D memory safe 100% without @Live. And the reason for that is because you can write your own storage allocator in D. If you can write your own storage allocator, how are you going to make it 100% memory safe without tracking lifetimes? I don't know of a way to do that. Perhaps Timon was misinterpreted, because I'm sure he understands this. DIP 1000 is capable of ensuring you don't have stack corruption, any dangling pointers to the stack. I believe that it's if we fix the couple of problems with it, it is sound in that you should not be able to generate any stack corruption if you're using DIP 1000. But that doesn't help you if you're writing your own storage allocator. For that, you need lifetime tracking.
I need to repeat myself from before and say that I need to talk to you, Walter, about @Live.
Okay. I'm sensing some disagreement with my sunny...
Yep.
Dom Disc asks, what about finishing @property? What's holding it back?
@property? Nobody cares about it. That's what's holding it back. I thought we dumped @property years ago. I'm surprised it's come up again.
Well, Alex was working on a dip for it, I believe, and he says later on in the chat here, he says time is what is holding it back. It's never been dumped. It's just there.
Yeah, it's just there. It just didn't get any more attention, and people just stopped using it. But it's there kind of for backwards compatibility.
Mukul Joshi asks, which operating system, code editor, and web browser do you use, Walter?
I use Micro Emacs, which is available on my personal GitHub account. And that's based on an Emacs clone that floated around the internet in the 1980s. And, I really liked it and started modifying it for my own needs have been using it ever since. It's, by modern standards, a pretty primitive editor, but I'm just so used to using it, I'm very productive with it, so that it being a primitive editor doesn't really matter. So that's what I use.
Ate Escala asks, should we start comparing ourselves to Go and or Rust when marketing?
No. That doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is anytime you have anything that's the slightest bit critical of Go or Rust, someone invariably pops up and says, you're wrong. Here's a way to make that work. You've mischaracterized it. You're deliberately showing something bad about it. And it's just not worth it. The best thing we can do is to show off what D can do and its strengths and let people who know Rust and know Go do their own comparisons of it. That works a lot better.
There's also some fallacy here too, because a lot of the time people, it's post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, in which because it was successful, they attribute it to something, but I don't think anybody knows. For instance, in one case, people keep bringing this up. We need to have a proper ID and market it so the language can be successful. But Go didn't have that. They only ended up having an ID after they became popular and not because of it. So
Max says, is there any plan for ImportC and the preprocessor?
There's not a solid plan, but the plan is likely to be to have DMD fork the associated C compiler's preprocessor in order to preprocess it, and then take the resulting output and feed that into ImportC. That's, to me, seems the most direct way to get it done.
Luis asks, Walter, is there any performance benefit for using the reversed parameters calling convention with context pointers, or just a workaround from the past?
Oh, that's a workaround from the past.
Esna asks, what do you think of hijacked packages being turned? Okay, the situation with NPM, where packages get hijacked and turned into malware and cargo and PI that are coming almost every week. What do you think can be done to prevent that from happening with D?
I think he's referring to the fact that people can replace or substitute existing libraries. So basically they're hijacking the library that cargo. And I think he's referring if this is possible with Dub right now and what we can do to prevent that.
I don't know.
Yeah, me neither, unfortunately. I haven't thought about it.
Neto asks, Walter, how can we make D more popular?
Write articles about it, record videos about it, and put them on Reddit and Hacker News. That's how you do it. Write about your projects. If you're doing something in D, write an article about it. It doesn't even really have to be very long. You did this neat project, and oh, by the way, it happens to be written in D. That's how you do things. That's how most languages become popular, is people see there's a game or an interesting project written in language X, and they go and look at that, and so they become familiar with language X by looking at the examples. How BASIC became very popular is a book was published, 101 BASIC games, and you could type those in on your personal computer, and they were written in BASIC, and that's how people learn BASIC. It's how I learned BASIC, was typing in those games. That's how you do things. So if you've written a game in D or an interesting project or whatever, put it on GitHub and write a brief article about it and let people know about it. That's how you do it.
So Ricky asks, can we have the core developers own language integrations into IDEs a la a shared library so that we can have proper IDE support without having to figure that part out?
Well, I've never used an IDE, so I take that back. Every time I fire up Visual C, Microsoft's IDE, it takes forever for the blasted thing to even load up, and it just takes over my machine, and I just exit out of it as soon as I can.
We have DCD, and I think it does a good enough job. What would really help here is being able to use DMD as a library to do that too, so that you could get proper parsing. But right now, for instance, with Emacs and DCD, there's not really anything I'm missing. It's usually, jump to definition and fly check, things like that.
Aside from what you guys are missing, is there a benefit to having IDE support as part of the core instead of as third-party ecosystem projects?
Yeah, obviously this, D is old, let's put it that way. These days, I think anybody starting a new language would start with that first. I've joked saying that, when you write a compiler, it should only incidentally generate code for a computer to execute. Everything else should be tooling, really. Yeah, there would definitely be benefit in that.
Peter says, I don't know if he's talking to somebody else or if he's asking this for you guys, but he says, did you know that Silq, SILQ, I guess this is not Symmetry's Silq, a quantum computing language from ETH Zurich, was written in D?
No, I did not know. That's cool.
Go Switzerland.
Okay, it's Timon's work. Any thoughts on introducing a feature to defer the type of templated instances to a later stage? This can bring advantages when creating instances where some of the templated types are irrelevant.
Well, I don't think we've had any thought in that direction. Although the compiler does try to not generate code for any templates that don't actually need code generated for them. So they're instantiated, but no code is generated for them. That's been fairly effective at reducing compile times.
Where are the named arguments? We've got the dip was accepted, but it hasn't been implemented yet.
It hasn't been implemented because nobody stepped up and implemented it. It's not that I'm trying to sabotage it or anything. It's just that there's just so many things I need to be doing that I haven't done that yet. But if somebody else wants to step in and implement it, that'd be great.
Maybe this is the kind of task that Alexander was asking for, because he wanted to champion a dip.
Well, it's already been accepted. Yeah, it's already been approved. Just needs the implementation.
Yeah. Okay, but championing doesn't also suppose that you need to implement it.
Well, I would think specification of a dip and implementing it are, different tasks. It doesn't necessarily need to be the same person.
Well, I think Max was already working on it. Dennis asks, since compiler switches are bugs, but the list keeps growing, any ideas to reduce the number of switches that DMD has?
I need to learn how to say no.
So that's just it. It's just you haven't said no. That's why they keep growing. So
that's why they keep growing, and I need to say no more often.
Walter, Razvan, Atila, final words from you guys to close out the conference, please.
Well, I sure hope our next one is live. I mean, is in person.
Oh yeah, sure. That would be awesome.
This was really fun, and D rocks.
Yeah, write more D.
Write more D. Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks to all of the speakers for putting together the talks. Thanks to all of the viewers for watching and for asking questions. Thanks to you guys for being here for the Ask Us Anything. Apologies for the things that went wrong this time. We'll try to get it better next year. And everybody, see you in the forums if I don't see you in DConf. And take care. Bye-bye.